is Neeta Misra. I'm the executive editor for public policy at Business World magazine. And this interview is part of our series on heterodox approaches to a post-pandemic world. We pay homage to the work of Alice Amsden and apply a contemporary lens to her ideas. I have with us today Professor Rolph van der Hoeven, who has held many distinguished positions, including being the chief economist for UNICEF and a senior leadership position in the ILO. Most recently, he was a professor at the Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University, a professor of employment and development policy. Welcome, Rolph. We're pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Do you consider yourself to be a heterodox economist?
Yeah, well, I consider myself a heterodox economist. Heterodox economists are those who feel that the neoclassical economic science is not always applicable in all situations, and that one has to look much more at the context, social patterns, etc. So in that respect, I consider myself a heterodox. There are many people who have problems with the neoclassical system. So you can define heterodox as very large or very small. And I probably fall in the large band. I'm not, let's say, staunch Marxist or something like that. But I just question a lot, and I do that since I finished my studies, some of the tenets of the neoclassical theory.
You've done some very interesting research on income inequality and globalization.
We started that work actually when I was in the ILO, when I was related to the World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization. That was something the then director of the ILO launched in 2001, 2002. It was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall in a decade before, and a lot of protest against globalization and the negative effects of globalization came up. And in that activity, I worked a lot also with Alice together. She did some background work for us. I knew Alice actually quite a long time ago already, when we started the project on the negative effects of the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and the IMF. It was one of the first projects the UNU wider undertook. And Alice Amsden did a study of Korea, and I did a study on Kenya. And since Alice worked also in Kenya, we got quite close actually, and always stayed in contact. So what we try to do with that work on globalization and income inequality is to unravel a little bit the causal change, and I can talk a long time about it, but I think that the shortcut was, and that's also I think what was close to Alice, it's not the international system itself which is causing often the inequality, although the inequities in the national system are there. But it is also national reactions, how labor unions, governments, social groups react to the challenges from abroad. And that relates to a point which Alice always brought up, and which I'm also very strong in, which we call policy space for developing countries. We need an international system, that's clear. The only way for the world to progress. I don't believe in autarky. We have seen that, for example, in the examples of Korea and Taiwan, how they managed to benefit from the foreign markets, but with strong national policies. And so always when there are new items coming up in the international system, in globalization, you have to test that against, is there enough policy space? And then the second question is, of course, do countries use that policy space for valuable social and economic goals? Some don't do that, others do that. But then we get into the political economic questions. Now, at the end of the 90s, what we saw that there was a wave of liberalism, and that the international system, as monetary funds and the World Bank, actually are propagating liberation of capital markets, liberation of labor markets. But that was only with the goal of maximizing the inputs of the production process. But the situation was actually that if you liberalize those markets without actually having those markets functioning, so those markets were not contestable. You could not have another form of the market as they were only imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. And so you got both from the fact that some developing countries were falling out of the system because they couldn't get into the system, which Alice also described, and also that national policies couldn't cope with it. So we got in a quite kind of murky system. So that's why from various sides the criticism on globalization came up in the beginning of the 20th century. And with a group of non-orthodox economists, heterodox economists, we called for not imposing on developing countries all the institutes which supposedly had worked in developed countries. They didn't do that always. We showed, for example, that actually the growth rate in the world was larger before globalization than after globalization because there were too many bottlenecks. So then we came up actually with some ideas of governing globalization, giving more emphasis to the social dimensions of globalization. That not maximizing economic benefits is not the only objective functions. There are also other objective functions, and if you don't take those into account, the system may break down, and you get also negative reactions and feedback mechanism. There was some, let's say, reactions to that. It was great, more and more it came acknowledged, to the extent that 2-3 years ago in the World Economic Forum, which is actually where the birth was of the neoclassical economics to govern the world, suddenly attention to inequality popped up. I don't know if you recall that 4 or 5 years ago, everybody, inequality is important. So it took a bit of a long time to get that message through, but now I think the message has gone home. It's not all countries' inequality gone up. Some did better, etc. But in the majority of the countries, we said both developed and developing countries. And now the question is, how should we deal with that? And the solutions we propose are both at the international level as well as the national level, and there need to also be a coherence between those two policies.
I think you also mentioned that the pandemic has had an impact. In fact, I think you look at the history of how pandemics affect inequality, and that pandemics generally tend to exacerbate inequality. What is the picture that's emerging in terms of?
Yeah, what we have seen is that make a difference between developed and developing countries and the emerging countries. That people who are in the bottom of the labor market, the people who have maybe not all the required skills, have low income, have not many capital or resources to fall back to, were very much more struck by the pandemic. Also because of the way the governments reacted. Home working became important. Well, if you don't have a computer or if you live in a 2-bedroom apartment with 5 people, home working is not an option, and you cannot, in economist terms, increase your marginal productivity. Your marginal productivity go down. So in the iron laws of economics, then you also get less paid. But that is, of course, very much unfair because you force a new system on a population group which has nothing to do, which was not the cause of that system. So that was one thing. I must say that certain governments, and most Western governments, took unprecedented easing of the monetary markets and funds available. I think 10, 15 years ago, that would not have happened because also of this complaint about globalization. Governments felt that something needs to be done. But there again, we see the inequality in the world, that the governments in the rich countries, I don't know the figures really by heart, but it's something like 12% of GDP, which is quite a huge number. Emerging countries, 6% of GDP, and least developed countries, only 1.2% of GDP. Now, if you realize that the income in least developed countries is 1/20 of developed countries, so 1.2% of a very low GDP means that the least developed countries were not able to boost the economy through demand-led activities, and had also few resources to deal with the citizens. And then the biggest scandal also was, but that is not financial but political, that the distribution of vaccines was very unequal. I mean, it led almost to a breakdown in the international system, that people were in countries, airplanes were compounded because the vaccine should not go from country A to country B, but stay in country A, etc. So also the international system was very much put on stress. And so another problem which was cropping up already just before is that developed countries went through a cycle of having less debt, international debt, but for a number of countries that was going up. And of course, if you're a feeble country and you lose some of your export markets for 6 months and you have to borrow more money, you quite quickly come in debt problems. Now, IMF proposed some measures in order to relieve the debt of developing countries. But nevertheless, a number of countries are now in big problem, and we going back to the problems of the 90s, when also the sovereign debt could not be repaid, and we had all kinds of schemes of the international system. Probably in your journal you have been discussing that very much on what to do with the debt, and that is coming back again. So some of the poorer countries. Come back to the point Alice and I made, they don't have any policy space anymore. They have just to accept what the international financial institutions are saying. They say now more about social issues than they say 20 years ago, but still the policy space is limited or not there. And then you see problems arising. Now, some of the problems are locally created. If you just recall maybe the problems in Sri Lanka, which was regarded by Alice and me actually 25, 30 years ago as a very promising country. And mainly because of wrong decisions and some domestic policy graft making, it's now in problems. But Sri Lanka is a country with good agriculture, a highly educated labor force. So there are two sides of the coin.
To another point in your paper about globalization and inequality, which is that you mentioned that education is a key driver of inequality. And we've seen over the pandemic that education has been very badly impacted. Where do you think policies need to focus, national policies, on bridging that divide now?
One rider with education. Education is only a key driver if there is demand for the educated people. So if you have a restricted policies and you don't grow, then the demand for educated labor is not there. And then you get sometimes the problem which we call educated unemployment. And I think it's a problem we have seen in Kenya, for example, in other countries. And then you get a situation that the richer parents, they don't want their children to take any job. They should also take the top job, but there's no top job. So those people just live then on, it's a tiny minority, but live on the income of their parents as long as they don't get that top job in the government or in industry. So education is important, but it should be also an expanding economy. You cannot say we put everything on education and that will solve the problem. Now with the pandemic, we have seen that certain skills have become much more scarce than other skills. And again, those skills are usually captured by the richer groups. Computer skills, social skills. So the skills which have become scarce in high demand during the pandemic are often not the skills which the lower income people have. So one need also to think about an education system which is giving much more attention to providing the skills which are at the moment needed. You have to target your education system. And here again, the North-South issue also plays. Support programs in developing countries need not only to give attention to traditional schools, but also to places where people can be creative, can use their creativity. Making use of the low cost of internet. There is Richard Baldwin, for example, has indicated that for example, in 5 years' time, I can speak to you in Dutch and you speak to me in English in this interview, and the interview will be perfect. And so that gives places for people in Kenya, South Africa, to tack on to the labor market in rich countries. But they should be prepared for that, and the infrastructure should be made.
You've also written on reforming the international finance and fiscal systems, essentially reforming development finance. Maybe you can give us some of the ideas that you have. I think you laid out 4 key reforms.
Yeah, the first reform is that there should be an international debt mechanism, the debt court somewhere where developing countries are treated in a better way than now. Then secondly, I mentioned already how little space the developing countries had to expand their economy. And so there has been talks, and you probably have discussed that also in your journal, on this issue of the special drawing rights. That is finally now, under the Biden administration, gave the green light to increase, and the Monetary Fund is doing that. The problem with the current system of this special drawing rights is that they're allocated to the size of the economy in the IMF. So the richest country gets much more. So there are all kinds of proposals actually that the rich countries should use their this time allocation to give it to, or to put it at the disposal of developing countries, so that they could expand a lot. And so that's the second point. And then the third point is also, and I mentioned that earlier already, because the countries are in debt problems, and they have to find technical advice of the financial system. There often, although there is an acknowledgement that the social sector should be catered for, if you look actually in the actual loan agreements, it's often that there still also be quite some reductions in those sectors. So that is also a point which needs very much taken into account.
Thank you for being with us today, Rolph. That was a very interesting discussion. And we look forward to having you back in our series.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.